Safavids of Isfahan, Abbasids of Baghdad, Umayyads of Damascus, Ottomans of Istanbul, Mughals of India. Islamic Empires is Justin Marozzi's tour de force, a breathtaking overview of Islam's triumphant march on the global stage. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming this wonderfully exclusive session by Mr. Justin Marozzi. Please welcome him on stage, and we'll get started. Thank you.
That's so kind, Niloufar. Thank you very much for that. I love the idea of having a wonderfully exclusive session. I should begin by my apologies to the Emperor Jahangir, whose tomb I would have paid my respects to this afternoon, but I'm delighted instead to be giving this session on Islamic Empires, which is my book that came out late last year in the UK. Some of the presentations, obviously, that have been given over the last few days have been highly academic, some less so. Mine, inevitably, is a broad overview because I wanted to cover 15 centuries of Islam, from the birth of Islam ending in the Gulf, in this case, Doha. So that obviously means that one has to be skate over the surface at times to cover the terrain. It took about 4 years to finish. So when I think about the number of minutes I have here today to talk to you about 15 cities in 15 centuries, let's say 45 minutes, 3 minutes a city, I feel a little bit like the 9th century Abbasid Caliph Mutawakkil surveying his harem of 4,000 beautiful concubines in Baghdad. It's quite a lot, but it would still be nice to have a few more. But in a nutshell, I suppose I would say the book is a little bit like the Islamic world's greatest hits. I've particularly chosen particular cities, particular leaders in different epochs, largely when I detected some of the most positive, glorious, resplendent epochs in a particular city's history, in a particular period of the history of Islam. And I tied it to cities because I wanted to try to write a new history of the Islamic world, still with a narrative chronology, but using the urban setting as a different platform through which to tell these stories. I have a background in journalism, but I didn't want to write the typical Western crisis of the Middle East, crisis of Islam, jihad books. That can be left with the newspapers and the commentators and the pundits. I wanted to write a very different story. And I've chosen the mostly glorious periods, as I said, from the birth in Mecca, ending in Doha. And I think I would say at this stage that for most of these 15 centuries, in my mind at least, the Islamic world is firmly in the ascendant as a global civilization. It's only much later in the story of those 15 centuries that the balance changes a little bit. Are we happy with the microphone? Is that better? And in my mind, you have this succession of Islamic empires lording it over the Middle East, North Africa, Central Asia, and swathes of the subcontinent here, parts of Europe too, ascendant both on the battlefield, which is one thing, but more interestingly, triumphant in the battle of ideas as well. And I think sometimes that can, again, in the Western media, in the Western outlook, that can be lost, that important part of the Islamic world's history. So with apologies for a little bit of a whirlwind, but necessitated by time, this will be a gallop through what was a 4 or 5 year project with 160,000 words. Those who are less historically minded among you, you can also think of this as an itinerary, a bit of travel writing to some of the most splendid and spectacular cities on earth. For me, there was no doubt about where the story should start. Of course, it's Mecca. We don't have Islam without Mecca, and you don't have Islam without the Prophet Muhammad, obviously. So the story will be more familiar to you than most other audiences, perhaps in a mountain cave high above the desert settlement of Mecca. It was not geographically a hospitable environment. It isn't a hospitable environment. The early Islamic poet Al-Haykatan called Mecca a place where winter and summer are equally intolerable. No waters flow, not a blade of grass on which to rest the eye. And in the Quran, it's described by Abraham as a valley without cultivation. But I suppose what is interesting is that the harshness of the environment is one thing climatically, but it's also a very fertile environment for prophets. And in the year 610, high up in his cave, the 40-year-old Muhammad, the merchant, has his revelation. And God speaks to him, and continued to speak to him for a number of years. Now, in the UK, apologies if this sounds frivolous, but it's about promotions and how people change very quickly. In 1952, the Brits say the current monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, went up a tree, a princess, and came down a queen with the death of her father. In Mecca, something much more extraordinary happens than that. I think it's almost one of the most spectacular promotions in history. The simple merchant Muhammad goes up the mountain, and he comes down as the prophet of God. I mean, that is the transformation, and Islam is born. And Mecca, obviously, is its lodestar from the very start, the sacred stone with the Kaaba at its heart, to which the world's 1.5 billion Muslims turn to pray every day. For me, as the sort of the outsider historian, I suppose I would say maybe the irony is that of my 15 cities, and there are plenty more that could be added, by the way, and I know people might ask me about Lahore later. I'm braced for a torrent of flack on that front, but I'll explain. In some ways, it is perhaps the least interesting of some of the other cities. It's the most insular, I suppose. It's the most exclusive, culturally, geographically. It's also remote. But I am not allowed to visit Mecca. It has undoubted spiritual attractions. That's completely obvious. But to its critics, in the Muslim world and outside, it is also can be perceived an exemplar of materialism, greed, and excess. So look at this, with a historian's hat on, to make way for the Abraj al-Bayt clock tower complex. In 2002, the authorities in Saudi Arabia demolished the 18th century Ottoman citadel, Ajyad citadel, and the authorities in Ankara and Istanbul called it a crime against humanity and cultural massacre. What does it give way to? A skyscraper complex of luxury hotels, apartments, shopping malls, heliports, jacuzzis, saunas, steam rooms, beauty parlors, 24-hour butler service. And remember that this development here, I don't know if this is working actually, but behind the Kaaba, stands on 95% of Mecca's millennium-old buildings. The house of Abu Bakr, Muhammad's closest companion, the first Caliph, became the Mecca Hilton. The Prophet's house buried beneath a new royal palace, and the house of Khadija, his beloved first wife, became a block of public lavatories. Now, I think in many countries that would be considered a very challenging use of a property development. Century by century, we're advancing through the chronology. So now we leave Mecca, 7th century, 8th century, and again, I think for me, looking for specifically a city in which to locate the next part of the story, there was no contest. It had to be Damascus again. I'm writing a new book at the moment on the Arab conquest, and Damascus obviously plays a huge role in there with the Umayyads. But it's this phenomenal display of both military muscle and spiritual heft. The Islamic Empire, or becomes an empire, surging out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century. And from 661, after the Caliph Ali's assassination, the capital moves to Damascus and never goes back into the Arabian Peninsula. Mecca becomes the spiritual heartland, but not the political administrative capital. And here the Umayyads hold sway till 750, and they are bloodily removed in turn, which we'll come to. But in this period, which I think is fascinating, I think the Umayyads get quite a bad press, in particular the Caliph Muawiyah, deeply divisive and controversial figure in Islamic history. But nevertheless, he is completely critical to the Arab-Muslim conquests. So he might get a bad press, but you can't. Thank you very much. You can't really think of the Arab conquest without Muawiyah's role. Deep into the Iberian Peninsula, the conquests go, and it only ends in 733 at the Battle of Tours, where a Muslim army, just used to success after success after success, finally is defeated by the Frankish leader Charles Martel the Hammer. Had that army not been defeated, the British historian Edward Gibbon wondered 1,000 years later, perhaps an Arabian fleet would have sailed unchallenged into the River Thames in London. And he wrote, perhaps the interpretation of the Quran would now be taught in the schools of Oxford, and her pulpits might demonstrate to a circumcised people the sanctity and truth of the revelation of Muhammad. In a way, Islam has come to Europe, of course. It's gone way beyond Europe as well, but in a different form. This is the completely sublime 8th century Umayyad Mosque of Damascus, the fourth holiest site for Muslims after those in Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem, and really the crowning architectural symbol of Islamic Damascus, also said to contain the head of John the Baptist. And again, I think with a historian's interest in the past, I'm fascinated by the layers of history in Damascus. The city is a great palimpsest. Islam written over Christianity, Christianity written over the monuments of pagan Rome, Rome replacing those of the ancient Assyrians. But Islam is what has proved most enduring in Damascus. This is primarily a history book, but I do use the present tense for some reportage with a sort of inveterate journalist DNA. We're going to use the clicker here, sorry. To bring the present into the narrative when it's important and when there are parallels. There's an Arabic word, fitna, conflict or strife internally. And one might argue that there are many countries in the region that suffer from this internal division. This is a view of the suburb of Arbin in Damascus. Many Arab writers used to regard Damascus with huge affection and admiration as one of a place of paradise. Beautiful green gardens, palaces, absolute splendor, intellectual preeminence. Now, in the words of the UN, it has been called hell on earth, and swathes of the city turned into an urban apocalypse. Syria transformed into a nation of refugees, of the dead and the dying, tragically. I spent 5 years before this book researching a history of Baghdad over 13 centuries, from its 762 to the 21st century. I spent some time living there, working there. But in the 9th century, where I use it here, it was perhaps the greatest city on earth. A fantastic center of pulsating science and scholarship, bloodshed and conquest, pilgrimage, procreation, and massive palatial building. One of my favorite characters from this period is an Arab writer called Jahiz, the goggle-eyed, considered one of the greatest writers of Arabic prose. A really master essayist, a very wide-ranging writer and intellectual. Just to give you a taste of the sorts of subjects he wrote about, the superiority of black men over whites, pigeon racing, Islamic theology, the Aristotelian view of fish, whatever that is, it's a complete mystery to me, and a little bit of naughtiness here, excuse me, whether women should be permitted to make noises of pleasure during sex. This is the 9th century Baghdad. And as I just researched more and more these cities at their high points, a very common theme emerged to me was that, like all the world's greatest cities, Baghdad is one of the most cosmopolitan at this time. Jews, Christians, and Muslims living together more or less happily. That, I should mention, by the way, was a 9th century Baghdad astrolabe. More discoveries made in mathematics and medicine in 9th century Baghdad than in any previous period of history. That's just to give one small example of the cultural development there. Beit al-Hikmah, the House of Wisdom, huge translation center, come think tank, come library, the biggest store of books in the world, on the positive side. On the less positive side, Baghdad emerges, or it becomes a focus of the sectarian splits between Sunni and Shia. It becomes the headquarters of the Arab world, or the Caliphate rather, from 750 to 1258. And in Islam's answer maybe to the Christian sectarianism between Orthodox and Catholic, Catholic and Protestant, you have the Sunni-Shia rivalry emerging, which obviously continues to this day. I used to be accused as a Brit in Baghdad, you Americans as well, you invented Sunni Shia. And had I known at the time what I know now, I would have pushed back a little bit. Yes, the invasion unquestionably ignited these terrible sectarian tensions, but sectarian tensions were there from day one of Baghdad. In 775, when the Caliph Mansur died, he left keys to an underground storeroom to his son and heir, Mahdi, and his wife Rita, who thought they were inheriting a great treasure of jewels and precious stones. They went downstairs. It was a crypt full of dead bodies, men, women, and children. All had been slaughtered with little leather ear tags, detailing their name and genealogy, where they came from. Every single one of them was a Shia. That's the year 775. So yes, the Americans and Brits have a terrible responsibility for what happened, but it is not only an externally imposed phenomenon. Quick time travel or geographical thing, 3,000 miles to the west, Cordoba, virtually at Islam's westernmost point then. And in the 10th century, I chose this one because really it was one of the greatest cities in the world again, and probably the finest and largest in Europe. Population of around 100,000, put it on a par with Constantinople. London and Paris, by comparison, had about 20,000, so 5 times the size of London and Paris. And again, the Islamic civilization flourishing made it a center of science and scholarship, art, music, and of course trade. And from 929, as an example of the single caliphate breaking up, it became a new self-declared caliphate from the splinter, the one surviving Umayyad prince. The Abbasids had butchered them in 750, almost to a man. The Caliph Safa, the shedder of blood, invited surviving Umayyad princes to a dinner and killed them, slaughtered them in cold blood, and supposedly sat on their writhing bodies and said, "I've never had such a delicious dinner." One only made it, escaped. For 5 years he was harried west, but he finally made it. It's just like it's an amazing detective thriller. Made it west, and he was the one who found the new caliphate. Abdul Rahman III. Sorry, the caliphate comes later. He founds what is an emirate, first of all. Caliphate later. Tolerance between the faiths, convivencia, the Spanish call it. Again, more or less harmonious coexistence between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And the most magnificent mosque in the Western Islamic world. Today called, depending on whether you're Muslim, Spanish, or otherwise, Mezquita Catedral. It became a church from 1236, and then a cathedral from 1523. And it is also the scene of some tensions, because there are Muslims who arrive here from different parts of the world who would like to worship. They're not allowed by the Spanish authorities. And so it remains controversial, but architecturally stunning. As also was these sprawling ruins of the 10th century palace city of Medinat al-Zahra, the shining city, which consumed a third of all state revenues for 40 years. A reminder of the wealth, power, and sophistication of medieval Islam. You know, these rulers wanted to make an impact and demonstrate their superiority to the world. 11th century, it sneaks in by 1 year, but I thought this is maybe a story within a story. The First Crusade, 1099, terrible scenes of carnage. I would call it the most contested city on the planet. I'm sure there are some others as well, but the most contested holy city on earth, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, to this day as well. It's home to the Temple Mount, the holiest site in Judaism, home to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which stands on the site of Christ's crucifixion, home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam after Mecca and Medina, and finally home to the most ancient surviving monument, deliberately eclipsing every other monument on the skyline, the Dome of the Rock, built by the Caliph Abdul Malik in 692 to eclipse the holy places of Jews and Christians on the site where Abraham had been prepared to sacrifice his son. So in 1099, a Crusader army reached Jerusalem here and put it under siege and then to the sword, cutting down swathes of Muslims in cold blood. This is Godfrey of Bouyon. In the UK, bouillon is a sort of is a stock cube, a flavour, exactly the same word, a bouillon. But in this case, he's not a beef-flavoured stock cube. He's a Christian hero of the First Crusade, celebrating this conquest. And the accounts make quite difficult reading, I think, in modern audiences. They're very graphic, they're very bloody, and you don't have the knights sort of disowning what they did. They are reveling in it. They're reveling in the bloodshed, and they talk about riding in blood up to their bridles. I think it's important because it is, we're not talking about Samuel Huntington and the Clash of Civilizations, but it is nevertheless an important moment in the history of relations between Christian West and Muslim East. And revenge followed. It took a while, but I chose the city of Cairo for my next century. And Saladin really restores honor to the Islamic world in the 12th century, retaking Jerusalem in 1187. The Crusader kingdoms in the Middle East lived on a little longer, but finally came crashing down in 1291. Architecturally, his greatest legacy was one of my favorite buildings in Cairo, and possibly some of yours, the Citadel. This amazingly evocative site from which you can just stare through the smog and look back in time thousands of years, from ancient Memphis to the great pyramids of Giza. My first experience of it was as a 17-year-old to go and learn Arabic in Cairo with a very small budget, staying in a notoriously cheap and dirty place called the Oxford Pension, where I just remember fighting off battalions of lice, fleas, cockroaches. Probably the cheapest hotel in Cairo, full of young people, filthy and like a furnace, 45 plus, July and August. But also a wonderful experience as a young person discovering a new city. There's a quote that many of you might know, Samuel Johnson, when a man is tired of London, he's tired of life. I always think that by comparison with the Egyptian capital, London seems almost insipid. And Cairo itself, I find, is life. It's so vital, visceral, suffocating, inspiring, squalid. It's shabby, it's splendid, it's ugly, it's full of tat. But this great tide of humanity it has makes for, an extraordinary experience. So when many centuries before Dr. Johnson was talking about how, if you're tired of London, you're tired of life, when London was just a Viking-ridden backwater of the world, Cairo was really the cynosure of the world. And again, we have that theme that crops up again, cosmopolitanism and tolerance. Great cities, I think, are open to the world. They're open to migrants, to trade, to ideas. I don't think tolerance and openness were incidental to the political and economic success of Cairo. They were its foundation, allowing the free flow of goods and ideas across the empire. Just as a sign of the times here, this is the great Jewish philosopher Maimonides, who came to take refuge in Cairo in 1165, and this is a draft of his Mishnah Torah legal code. And they give this, it's a store of documents, they're called the Geniza documents, named after the storeroom in a synagogue, which contained more than 1,000 years of Jewish history in Cairo, in sort of official documents, births, marriages, deaths, shopping lists, commercial contracts, shipping information with amazing detail, rediscovered in the 19th century. I tend to say a lot of these cities are my favorites, and Lahore is becoming another new favorite, which we can talk about in the question. Sadly, it's not in my list, but I would say that Fez is somewhere I've known for much longer and is definitely one of my favorite cities in the world. In the 13th century again, resplendent, self-confident, and vigorously cosmopolitan, home to the world's oldest university, the Qarawiyyin, founded by a wealthy widow in the 9th century. Talk about sort of female empowerment, and the 9th century female founder of this grand university. And in the 13th century, you see the Marinids stamping their Islamic mark on the city by just building madrasa after madrasa after madrasa, saying, look, we may be Berbers from the desert and the mountains, but we are serious, we're proper Muslims, and we are putting Fez on the map. And they really are a stunning showpiece. This is a view through the Bab Bujlud entrance to the Medina, and in the background you can see the Bouynania Madrasa, one of the most beautiful monuments in the city, which is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And I like it as well. It's the largest car-free city in the world. And when I last went with my wife, we were going out for dinner within the Medina, and it was quite a complicated route because this is an authentic Medina full of narrow zinca, alleys, zukak. And I said, oh, don't worry, we'll find it. I'll just put it in the phone, go from A to B and Google Maps or whatever. And the phone sort of went whirring, and then a little message came up saying, unable to find a route. I thought fantastic that 21st century technology couldn't actually get us from A to B. We just have to navigate our own way through this fabulous city. Probably one of the smelliest places in my cities, the Chawara tanneries, where workers have toiled in remarkably similar conditions, really, for almost 1,000 years. The wells which these men are navigating here are filled with cow urine, pigeon feces, quicklime, salt and water, really tough on the skin, but to soften the leather hides. Anyone who's been to this area of Fez may remember the incredibly aggressive guides. I've just been shopping in Lahore the last few days, and I'm just marveling at how civilized and easy it is. Whereas in Fez, you're lucky if you're not just physically dragged in, thrust into the shop, and put under sustained pressure to buy anything. It's quite difficult. 14th century was sort of firmly etched in for me with Tamerlane. I have to be a little bit lazy sometimes, and I'd written about Tamerlane years earlier. But Samarkand is one of, again, 14th century Samarkand, one of the greatest cities in the world, certainly in Central Asia. Why was it so great? Because this man plundered everything in sight over what I think is the most extraordinary military career. 35 years undefeated. He barely stood or sat still. He was always on the move. Timur the Lame, another reason that makes him remarkable. He was lame in his right side, arm and leg, at a time when you needed to be martially strong and tough to inspire your fellow soldiers to join you. And he still managed to do that. Much of his career was spent brandishing the banner of jihad. Who were the overwhelming victims of his jihad? Muslims, to a man and woman. Very few, but by comparison, very few Christians and Jews and other and Hindus killed. Beirut to Baghdad, Antioch to Aleppo, Damascus to Delhi. Timur was savagely successful. The only time in Ottoman history that the Sultan was captured in person was in 1402 when Timur defeated Bayezid, humiliatingly for the Ottomans. He could have continued west. The European princes and kings wrote these pathetically sycophantic letters saying, "Oh, congratulations on your great victory over the terrible Ottomans. Please don't come further west." He couldn't be bothered. It was backwater. The real treasures lay east, and he devoted the remainder of his life to building up an army to attack the Ming dynasty of China, and died before he could do it in the late 60s, after an extraordinary career in the saddle. This is not a phallus, ladies and gentlemen. If you look more closely, it's a tower built of skulls. That was his battlefield signature all across Asia, these huge monuments. If you look carefully at the soldiers here, you know they're holding heads. After he took Damascus, the soldiers received an order, "Every one of you brings me 2 heads." And there they are, the decapitated corpses. I think when Baghdad fell, it was something like, was it 20,000? Hang on, I've got the numbers here somewhere. They were covered in oil and set alight as dreadful warmings. Tens of thousands of heads in a circle around the city in Baghdad, Damascus. It was a very clear message. If you think about resisting me, this is what will happen to your city. You might want to strike a peace deal now before my armies are given the go-ahead. Make up your own mind, you know. He's also much more interesting than that, though. He's a genius military leader, but for me, he's more interesting than that. He's great builder, patron of the arts. The Timurid architectural legacy will be familiar to loads of us in the room today. These blue-sheathed monuments, mosques, minarets, madrasas, mausolea. This actually postdates Timur, the Registan, which the British Foreign Secretary George Curzon called the noblest public square in the world. And when he finally died in 1405, you can almost hear Central Asia and the Middle East breathing this great sigh of relief. You know, thank God he's gone. This man has wreaked havoc across the largely Muslim world. And this is his resting place, the Gur Amir Mausoleum in the heart of Samarkand. Next city, again a landmark date really, 1453. For 800 years, Muslim armies had attempted to take Constantinople, and for 800 years they had failed, invariably repelled by the monumental Theodosian walls that dated back to the 5th century. Then in 1453, this man came along, 21-year-old Sultan Mehmet II, painted here by Bellini in 1480. And I think what's so interesting reading about him and the campaign is that he grew up as a child obsessed with taking out Constantinople. It was called, in the Muslim world, the Arab world, a bone in the throat of Allah, and it had to be removed. I'm compressing now what is a long chapter here on the operation, but meticulously well planned, the throat slitter, castle fortress built high up on the Bosphorus to form an embargo to shut off the city from the outside. It was methodical. In one example, he pulls out the entire Ottoman fleet of the water to circumvent the great chain that blocks off the enemy fleets. Ship by ship are pulled out of the water, hauled up the hill, across the land, down back into the waters of the Golden Horn, 1.5 miles. At a stroke, he controlled the Golden Horn, and the Byzantines within the city were quivering. And he finally removed what the Muslim writers, had described as the bone in the throat of Allah. Relentless bombardment, storming the walls, I'd be failing lamentably in my promotional responsibilities here today if I didn't mention that there are many more details forthcoming in a gripping chapter 9 of the book. The Hagia Sophia. It's not overnight, but Christian Constantinople over time becomes Muslim Istanbul, city of the world's desire. This was the monument completed by my namesake Justinian back in 537. So you're almost 1,000 years later. It becomes a mosque with minarets. And in 1935, Ataturk turned it into a museum, which it has remained to this day, though there are more and more discussions and rumblings of turning it back into a mosque. You can imagine what the Greeks would make of that, UNESCO and others. But actually, as a passerby, you think, oh, actually, it is a mosque. You can hear the call to prayer. Technically, the minarets are behind it in another mosque, but to all intents and purposes, it often does feel like a mosque. But I think, again, one of the world's great cities again. I think it reminds me a little bit of Cairo, but I think Cairo now, the level of suppression has reached such heights that it's a less comforting place, maybe a comfortable place to be in. Over time, Constantinople becomes less cosmopolitan. In 1927, the Greek Orthodox community was 100,000. Today, there are only 3,500 ethnic Greek residents in Turkey. And during my chapter on Istanbul, I speak to lots of Turks who said, I used to grow up here, that used to be the Jews, this used to be the Christians, this used to be so-and-so, the Armenians, and so on. Really different population now. Ataturk sort of hastens the end of that polyglot, multicultural Istanbul. And I raided Orhan Pamuk's lovely book on Istanbul for some of this chapter, and he talks about the huzun, the melancholy. The Arabic word is hazin, sad. But this sort of end of empire melancholy that he feels in Istanbul. And just when you thought we'd seen the end of dreaded Tamerlane, here comes his great-great-great-grandson, Babur, the tiger. Hashish smoker, wine drinker, poet, memoirist, founder of the Mughal Empire, and a green-fingered horticulturalist, so passionate about his soft borders that he was known as the Gardener King. Took Kabul in 1504, which became the center of his expanding empire. Probably, I think, at this point, someone was telling me last night, Lahore could have been my 19th century, or maybe the 16th century as well, or a little bit later. I chose Kabul because I was actually working there at the time as well. I've been working there the last few years, on and off. Also, I love the character of Babur. I think he's a fantastic historical character. And I say character because he's fully revealed in this wonderful memoir, the Baburnama, one of the greatest memoirs ever written. E.M. Foster was a fan in the UK, and in the words of one Islamic historian, Babur represents for Islamic civilization what his Italian contemporary Benvenuto Cellini represents for European civilization, the most completely revealed individual of the 16th century. And I love going through his letters and the diary. On 27th of November 1528, he wrote to his son the following letter. And as an occasional correspondent for the Spectator magazine, I loved this because it could have come straight from the Spectator style guide. This is 1528. He's writing to his son, "In future, write without elaboration. Use plain, clear words. It will be less trouble for you and the reader." Here he is on the dangers of mixing wine and hashish at a party. A hashish party never goes well with a wine party. The drinkers began to make wild talk and chatter from all sides, mostly in allusion to hashish and hashish eaters. Babajan, when drunk, said many wild things. Try as we did to keep things straight, nothing went well. There was much disgusting uproar. The party became intolerable and was broken up. I think how familiar that sounds. My point being, I guess, we're talking about Islamic rule in a very sort of tolerant, enlightened style, exemplified by Babur and many of his Mughal descendants, especially Akbar the Great, ruling a multi-faith empire. And this, I think, appropriately, given his love of gardening and horticulture, is where he's buried in one of Kabul's most beautiful landmarks, restored like a number of monuments in Lahore by the Aga Khan Foundation. And there's a lovely inscription. behind this elderly gentleman. Only this mosque of beauty, this temple of nobility, constructed for the prayer of saints and the epiphany of cherubs, was fit to stand in so venerable a sanctuary as this highway of archangels, this theatre of heaven, this light garden of the God-forgiven angel king, whose rest is the garden of heaven, Zahiruddin Muhammad Babu the Conqueror. I like it because it's sort of very florid prose for a man who was passionate about his flowers and his gardens. And just a reminder, the American helicopters here, that Afghanistan has been a country at war ever since 1979. And this is how I've been traveling in and out of Kabul, from the airport into the center of town to the embassy, in a very elderly RAF Puma, which is great fun on one hand, but it's also a sad sign that security is considered so bad for Brits and many other visitors that they don't want to use the road. But there we are, Kabul. Now, this rather seductive-looking gentleman is Shah Abbas I, ruler of the Safavid dynasty from 1588 to 1629, and again, what creates one of the most magnificent cities on earth, Isfahan. And here, I think, on reflection, I started to think this is where the balance between Muslim world and the West begins to accelerate, increasingly to the advantage of the richer and technologically more advanced West. But remember, this is the 17th, 16th, late 16th, early 17th century, so 1,000 years after the time of the Prophet Muhammad. Up until then, I think it's fair to say that the balance has been very firmly on one side. Again, a lovely city. The British travel writer Robert Barron, who was famously hard to impress and a very caustic, sarcastic writer, was famously unimpressed by a lot of what he saw in Central Asia, and he likened the Ali Kapu Palace of Isfahan to a brick boot box. But when it came to this particular building, the Sheikh Lutfallah Mosque, a royal place of worship, he was moved to complete raptures. He compared it to Versailles, the Doge's Palace, St. Peter's, the porcelain rooms at Schönbrunn, and he reckoned that each one of those fell short by comparison. But a crowning masterpiece of Iranian art. As is the neighboring Masjid Shah, crown jewel on the colossal main square, Maidan Naqsh Jahan, image of the world square. The foundation inscription reads, "A second Kaaba has been built." A very sort of pithy expression of the Safavids' ambition to rule the Islamic world. And who says the Iranian regime today feels any different? Here we are, the great public space. To give a few snapshots of Isfahan, justifying the old Iranian proverb, Isfahan Nesfi Jahan. Isfahan is half the world. Fascinating because it's largely, the product of one man, Shah Abbas, creating a city like Pierre L'Enfant in Washington, Baron Haussmann in Paris. There are a few people we can think of that single city builders. Again, stricken with guilt and not having Lahore here, I went for Tripoli for my 18th century. I don't think it particularly justifies itself as for importance, but for me personally, I've been traveling there since I was 18. My father used to do business there. He'd been born in Beirut, which was the next city after this, and I've always liked Tripoli. It made a great nuisance of itself to the West and Europe in the 18th century, and I found it interesting that there's this upstart dynasty of pirates, essentially, who say to the Ottomans, back off. We're going to run this place, thank you very much. We're just throwing off the colonial yoke and launching attack after attack with impunity on European and other foreign shipping. And eventually the newly independent United States has had enough and said, right, this is war now against the Karamanli dynasty. And it's interesting, I think, in global history, this is the first time the US goes to war as an independent nation, 1801 to 5. And to this day, if you ever hear an American Marine singing a hymn, the Marines hymn, I should say, it begins, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we fight our country's battles in the air, on land and sea." I did a bit of reporting in Tripoli as well during the revolution of 2011. This was one of the younger revolutionaries I met, bringing the rule of Muammar Gaddafi to an end after 42 years, and tragically, as we now know, unleashed turmoil ever since. In 2019, I finished a 3-year assignment as advisor to the Prime Minister's office in Libya, and about 3 days after I stopped it, I just thoroughly ground down by the awfulness of the situation. General Haftar, Field Marshal Haftar, launched his attack on Tripoli, and as we speak, fighting continues. A 76-year-old general who has no interest in democracy and thinks Libya has to be ruled like this, but is not strong enough to take the city. Tripoli's old city, lovely. Not a patch on Lahore, absolutely right. But still enchanting, crumbling away today, totally neglected, as is much of the city. 19th century. Again, a bit of a personal thing here. My father was born in Beirut in 1938. His parents, wanting to flee war on its way in Europe, married quickly and moved to Beirut. And I discovered in the process of writing this book that I had actually a Lebanese Christian great-grandmother. Perhaps I'll have to track that family down one day. But in the mid-19th century, Beirut becomes this unbelievably fast-growing city at the foot of Mount Lebanon, flourishing trade, universities, the Renaissance in this spectacular city. A peninsula that seems to have fallen to earth from the heavens, a Lebanese writer wrote. But one of Beirut's great strengths is also one of its great weaknesses. The multi-faith cosmopolitan population. And I remember my father being terribly sad about the 75 to 1990 civil war, which reduced much of the city of his birth to ruins. This chapter in my book ends with the story of 3 really interesting people, one by one assassinated in sort of 2005. And the last line, I think, is, Beirut is sun-kissed, sybaritic and welcoming, but it is also dangerous, blood-stained and cruel. Dubai had an interesting 20th century. It really goes from utterly insignificant pearl fishing village to something rather larger. And in the mid-19th century, the surest sign that the Brits were about to invade, bombard, or simply appropriate your country came in the polite and earnest form of cartographers and surveyors. When you saw Brits putting a map together, there was reason to worry. And this is 1822. But just look at the size. That is Dubai. A handful of houses, a sheikh's house, a watchtower, a couple of gates, wells, and a couple of date plantations. 1975, still pretty small, bit of a backwater. But the creek here, which we see, called by Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum as the very heart and soul of Dubai, it's raison d'etre. And in the 50s, they bet the farm on dredging the creek, borrowing huge amounts of money, because they saw that, if you don't get the creek right, if we can't get ships in and out, there ain't no trade here. There's no city. And I would say there's that build it and they will come borderline recklessness about the Al Maktoum's approach to development, but it has worked. Is it sustainable? That's another question. The model is, and my wife and I were there the other day for the sort of sister literary festival to this about 2 weeks ago. We came across a headline that was, the model is endless development. That, by definition, that's not sustainable. And over time, the Emiratis are becoming a smaller and smaller and smaller minority in their own country. But again, the chapter ended on a positive note. I was talking to an Emirati academic about how a lot of other Arabs, in particular, are quite snooty about Dubai. They're very flashy, no history, kitsch. And then she said, but you find me an Arab, a Sudanese, an Algerian, a Moroccan, an Iraqi, a Lebanese who doesn't want to come and live in Dubai. They all do. And there's something in that, It has become one of the most cosmopolitan and peaceful places in that region. And I ended really, probably a little bit too similar to Dubai, but it's a different story. There are similarities. But again, I was doing some work with the British Council, and I thought, I'm not going to, there's only so many places a writer can go with limited funds. And I thought it's an interesting story purely as a story of a city development. You can put ideology and politics to one side. As a city development, One of the most fascinating examples to go from nothing to this within, I would say, the 21st century. Architects from all over the world, I.M. Pei, Zaha Hadid, John Nouvel, the sort of ultimate rags to riches story. This is the Museum of Islamic Art. And the Qataris have we've been able to buy culture, buy Islamic culture. The natural gas, the petrodollars. But again, the similarity with Dubai, the Qataris are increasingly a smaller and smaller minority in their own country. Not everyone likes that. And if you're not being consulted about it, that also raises questions for the future. We're ending, ladies and gentlemen, on another bit of naughtiness. This is West Bay Doha by night, a virile symbol of the city triumphant, the heart of the richest country in the world per capita. Tornado Tower on the left, and next to that is Burj Doha, Doha Tower. And the Al-Thanis wouldn't like to hear me say this, but unofficially it has a very different nickname. Qataris know it for a very good reason, simply as the condom. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.